I want to pause for a second and ask just a few questions. And you can answer these survey questions in Google Classroom. How many of you guys are keeping up with the Kardashians? No, not the Kardashians. How many of you guys are keeping up with the coronavirus? Like maybe you look at death tolls. Do you think that America or the world has overreacted to the coronavirus, or do you think that it's a justified reaction? What do you think the government should do about the virus? And then how has online learning been for this class? Well, Kara's actually already answered me. She said it was boring. Hopefully she doesn't think that after this video though. But once you've answered those questions, you can continue on in this video. As we continue to look at Reconstruction, one of the things you'll notice is that the South actually gets divided up into military sections or districts based on their bad behavior. I feel like every time I say the word district, I hear that weird, odd whistling noise. Well, anyways, the Army forced the South to follow these rules. Why did the North force the South to follow these rules? Well, it's actually a fairly simple answer. And as we look at it, it's really because the South enforced what were known as the Black Codes that we mentioned earlier. So with the division into 5 different districts, America looked at this like, oh wait, no, America didn't look like this, that's Panem. America looked more like this. There we go, that's the map that I was looking for, that's it. A Union general would actually control parts of each region. They also made sure blacks could vote or hold office. Actually, the first black man to hold office, Hiram Rhodes Revels, would be elected in 1870 and serve in the state of Mississippi. Also, Southerners who wanted states' rights back again had to show steps of equality by giving blacks the ability to meet. Oh, and Confederates weren't allowed to meet. In addition to those things mentioned above, the South also needed to create new and more equal constitutions, as well as ratify the 14th Amendment. Once these requirements were met, the northern occupation of these southern districts would leave. Now, all these changes, sound awesome and great, but for some blacks, they were actually put in a really awkward situation. You see, the group that had given the blacks these freedoms, the Radical Republicans, obviously wanted blacks to join their party and be just as radical as they were against the Democrats in the South. But if they did this, if they followed the radical position, they would be denying other people rights that they were so long denied. Well, on the other hand, they could not be radical Republicans and instead just be moderate Republicans, but that would mean they would be disliked by radicals and they could lose their position. Oh, America, even when you get it right, you get it wrong. So, bottom line, blacks could vote. Yes and no. You can't say yes and you can't say no, Mr. Dickinson. Just give me a second and let me explain, okay?
Election day, ain't it?
Sure is.
John Brown's body lies a moldering in the grave. John Brown's body lies a moldering in the grave. John Brown's body lies a moldering in the grave. His truth is marching on. He's gonna be a soldier in the army of the Lord. He's gonna be a soldier in the army of the Lord.
We like Republican tickets.
We ain't got those yet. Just the Democrat tickets.
We'll wait.
Might be a pretty long wait.
Let me explain something to you. These men are here to vote. And they mind dying a whole lot less than you do.
Let's see if I can find any.
In the short video you just watched, you saw black people vote, but let's make some conclusions based on what was happening in that video. Number one, they probably were in the South due to the situation that was going on. Number two, the blacks were probably going to vote for Republicans. Number three, the whites were probably going to be voting for Democrats. Number four, after the vote, you see the count, and you see that the count is just way off. That was one way the South actually kept blacks from being able to vote, even after some of these laws would change, and we'll eventually get the creation of the 15th Amendment, which we'll mention later. From a purely economic standpoint, the South was in shambles and needed to be rebuilt. Businesses needed to be established, and some Northerners actually realized this, and they decided, hey, you know what? If I move to the South, there's little competition. I can dominate the businesses in the South. I can make way, way more money. These people become known as carpetbaggers. We'll just talk about them in the next slide. And it wasn't just about business. They could also dominate politics. Most Southerners weren't allowed to run for office, meaning that there were empty seats that needed to be filled, and they could be filled by these Northerners. As I mentioned before, these Northerners would be called carpetbaggers. And the reason that they got this nickname of carpetbagger is because the suitcases which they brought with them were actually made of carpet. So that's how they got this nickname. Oftentimes, when you're looking at a nickname that is given to a people group in history, it's a way to make fun of them or a way to identify them. Some Southerners saw an opportunity to work with these Northerners, and those Southerners that were working with these Northerners, they would be called scallywags. These Southerners were looking for their own personal gain. It was almost like, how much would it take for you to sell your friend out? What reward would it take? What would that reward need to look like for you as an individual? For these scallywags, it was monetary most of the time, and because of what they were doing, they were almost viewed as traitors to the South. We're going to fly through some of this next stuff, even though it's pretty interesting and has some pretty cool stories. So, after Lincoln died, who was president? That's right, it was Andrew Johnson, but Congress disliked Johnson quite a bit. And to be quite honest, Johnson didn't like Congress either. But Johnson was a constitutionalist, meaning that even if Congress passed a law over his head, he would still follow what they wanted or follow whatever that rule was. And this is going to get Johnson into trouble in just a little bit. Congress created what was known as the Tenure Office Act, or the Tenure of Office Act. Congress passed a law that made it illegal for the president to remove anyone without permission from the Senate. This would make the president much weaker and make Congress much stronger. Johnson wanted to see how something like this would work, so what he did was he fired his Secretary of War. This man's name was Edwin Stanton. This created a rather awkward situation between the groups, though, because Stanton actually refused to leave his office. He actually barricaded himself in his office, and when Johnson tried to forcibly remove him, he couldn't. The way that he got food and water and different things like that was that he would lower a bucket down from the window and bring stuff up in the window. Now, if you're thinking about this, when you eat food and when you drink water, you've got to use the restroom. So he probably had a bucket restroom and a food restroom. Wouldn't it be so gross if he mixed those two things up? Anyways, as we move on, the radicals now actually have a reason to impeach Johnson. Johnson had broken a rule that Congress had established, and thus they have reason for impeachment. So for the first time in history, not the last, a president was up for impeachment. In a close vote of 126 to 47, 126 in favor of impeaching him, Johnson loses the first part of the case. Kind of similar to how Trump went through the House of Representatives. That's exactly what Johnson went through too. So this is enough to get him to the next phase. I'm not sure what Johnson's reaction was, but he didn't bother actually trying to defend himself, although others did. And the reason he didn't bother trying to defend himself was because he didn't want to look guilty, something very similar to what President Trump did as well. So, what's the sitch? What's going on here? Well, Johnson had removed Secretary of War Stanton, who was part of his cabinet. But Stanton, if you remember, wouldn't have been appointed by Johnson. He would have been appointed by Lincoln. So this brings up the question, can they actually kick him out for the removal of Stanton? And the answer is not as straightforward as you think. They weren't actually kicking him out based on him breaking any laws. Honestly, they were kicking him out because they didn't like him. And the impeachment process would now move to the Senate. During the Senate vote, there were 54 members. So comment down below on how many states would be represented by those 54 members. And the vote was 35 in favor and 19 for innocent. Now, to kick him out, they would need 2/3. Now, some of you guys might be doing that math in your head to figure out what that percentage was. Meanwhile, Paul, he's already figured it out, and he's found a new way to calculate pi. But all jokes aside, the percent that they got with that 35 was 64%. And if you round up, it's 65%. And in order to kick him out, they actually needed 36 votes. If they would have gotten 36, just one more vote, they would have had 66%, and that would have been enough to kick him out. By one vote, they did not kick him out. Later, the Tenure Office Act actually becomes unconstitutional anyways. But this becomes important because it sets a precedent, an example. And the example that gets set is, you can't just kick out a president because you want to. There has to be an actual law or some reason for you to kick him out.